In this vignette, let us try to summarize and outline the past lessons we have had so we can put ourselves in the right perspective and understand what we have been talking about. At the beginning, we have mentioned the fact that God has given all men the reason, a powerful mind to be able to discover the true God and the true religion. And all men have this power in his mind to find God until such time when he discovers his self and begin to consider only his self-interest, meaning to say, a point in his life when he begins to become selfish. In the Catholic religion, we call this original sin, or the fallen nature of man. And because we are going to lose this mind of ours, this innocent mind of ours eventually, God gave us an aid. And this aid is divine revelation. And so we have the Old Testament where God gave them divine revelation. And we also have the New Testament where God equally gave us divine revelation. Now notice that in the Old Testament, the divine revelation consists of two things. First, God gave them commandments. And secondly, God gave them how they would obey those commandments. In fact, the how had so many little commandments in them to the point that the Pharisees were adding and subtracting to them, thus giving the Jewish people a heavy burden. And so when Christ came to the New Testament, he also gave us commandments. And these commandments, side by side, he gave us how to obey these commandments. Now keep in mind that both the commandments of God and how to obey them are divinely revealed. These commandments had to be revealed by God because man, by his own mind, covered with selfishness, can never discover what these commandments are. He might discover one or two of the commandments, but definitely, even in the Old Testament, he could have not discovered all the commandments of God. And if he knows one or two commandments, he would not know whatsoever how to interpret them correctly. So you see, because of the fallen nature of man, divine revelation becomes a necessity. Because without divine revelation, that mind of man, first given to him in an innocent state, but destroyed by selfishness, would never know the true God and the true religion. Because the New Testament is the perfection of the Old Testament, therefore the divine revelation given to us in the New Testament is even more difficult to discover simply using the human mind. If it is difficult enough to discover the commands of God and its correct interpretation in the Old Testament, it becomes even more impossible to discover the commandments of Christ and its correct interpretation in the New Testament if you only use human reason. Since this divine revelation given to us in the New Testament is so important, while Christ was giving it, the apostles and their followers tried to gather them together, knowing very well that if they lose only one or two of this divine revelation, there is no way by which the human mind could recover them. And so while Christ was revealing these things to us, the fathers of the church, so-called, made up of the apostles, their disciples, and the disciples of their disciples, collated them together, seeing to it that nothing was left out. And as they were collating it, they, of course, referred it to the apostles to make sure which was coming from God and which were coming from mere man. So this divine revelation in the New Testament is simply made up of all the things that Christ taught and all the things that Christ did. But when the fathers of the church collated all the teachings of Christ and all the things that he did, they found out that there was so much. Even St. John the Evangelist said so, that if you put together all the teachings of Christ and all the things that he did, which is part of the teachings of Christ, it would have occupied all the libraries of the world. And so the fathers of the church, when they collected all this divine revelation, what Christ taught and what Christ did, and finding it too lengthy, they just chose a few of the teachings that would summarize all the teachings of Christ. Just a few that would summarize, sort of a table of contents for all the teachings of Christ. They collected all these summaries or outlines and called it the New Testament. And so notice that the New Testament only contains a little of the teachings of Christ and a little of the things that Christ did. All the rest are found in the writings of the fathers of the church. Now that the entire divine revelation of the New Testament had been collected by the fathers of the church, in which case they really added nothing and took off nothing, since now it is there all preserved in the writings of the fathers of the church, the next problem is how to transmit this through the centuries to the members of the Catholic Church without modifying any of the teachings of Christ. And Christ knew very well immediately that he gave this responsibility to a group of people, then the church would be such a mess that the bishops, if given to several bishops, would start quarreling immediately on what are the commands of Christ and what is the correct interpretation. And true enough, even in the year 100 after Christ, a group of bishops, followers of Marcion, some of them Montanist, and the others Gnostics, began to go astray. The whole city of Thyatira, as we mentioned before, was one day totally Catholic, and the next day was totally Montanist. Now, God knew very well that would happen. So Christ, even before he ascended into heaven, gave the responsibility of preserving the entire divine revelation to one office with very great powers to preserve divine revelation, and this office is the office of the papacy. And true enough, in the midst of the era of the apostles, the first Christian sect separated themselves from the Catholic Church. Mind you, in the midst of the apostles. If they can separate from the Catholic Church in the midst of the apostles, how much more we today who have no apostles around us? And this community is the Corinthians. They were the first Christian sect Today, all Christian sects have the defects that they had, but the tragedy is that most of us Catholics have the same defects. And what are their defects? St. Paul says, they were wise in their own conceit. Wise in their own conceit. They were leaning to their own understanding, trusting in their own understanding, therefore they erred from the truth. They are full of their own ideas and interpretation. And Paul says, now, you do not need us. And they prided themselves on a wisdom separated from the truth of apostolic tradition. And so let us return to what is basic, that in order to discover the true God and the true religion, we must trust on our own minds first. We must go in silence and solitude. We must listen to the voice within us. Is it the true shepherd who is speaking to us, or is it merely the voice of someone else pretending to be the good shepherd? Try to shut out everything, all preachers and speakers. Tell them to be silent and tell yourself, I must see who is calling me. The true God said he would be calling, and his true sheep will know the sound of his voice. I must see in silence and solitude who is calling. God bless you.